let's take a look at some examples of real book jacket designs. The ones that I picked here are all similar subject matter in the sense that they're all books that have to do with history, and they're all books that are a similar size and dimensions to the jacket that you worked on. So what I'd like to do is to just kind of methodically go through them and see if there's any patterns that we can identify, some things that are common to these covers that we could use in our own work. So first of all, if I'm looking at the layout and I'm looking at the proportions of the layout, the way that the designer used the rule of thirds, on most of these I see a pretty distinct rule of thirds kind of a layout. This Cleopatra book, it's basically 2/3 image, 1/3 title and author information. There's another Cleopatra book, different author, different cover design, similar as well, 2/3 image, 1/3, approximately 1/3 text or type, title and author. This one as well, it's approximately 2/3, 1/3, about 2/3 image, 1/3 type, although, it does go off of that a little bit. This as well. Essentially it's 2/3, 1/3. It's a little bit harder to detect on this one because it's a more complicated image, but this little, you'd call this a cartouche, this little circle with the text inside, I would say that's about 2/3 down the page. This one as well, about 1/3 on the top versus 2/3 on the bottom. So we have, for the most part, we've got a 2/3, 1/3 division. So that's something that we see in common. Another thing that we see in common for the most part is that the title of the book is the largest thing on the page, or the first thing aside from the image. So actually we could backtrack a little bit and say that there's usually a strong central image that grabs the reader's eye, or the potential reader's eye, and makes us kind of be curious to read, hey, what is this all about? And the next thing that we would see is the title of the book. So the title of the book is definitely larger and more prominent than other information on the cover. So for books like this, for history books, generally the subject matter or the title of the book is going to be something that the reader's looking for, and they're not going to be as familiar with an author. I mean, maybe it's a famous author or somebody that the reader might be familiar with, but generally if we look at and see the author names, they're quite a bit smaller than the title. And there's a definite difference. There's no mistaking the idea that the title of the book in this case is more important than the author. Now, if the chosen subject matter that you designed your book jacket for is a fiction book, sometimes the author's name can be more important than the title. So, for example, the first thing that comes to mind for me is an author like Anne Rice, who does the Vampire Chronicles. If you see a book by Anne Rice, you see in giant letters, you'll see Anne Rice, and then the title of the book might be smaller. But that's because she's almost kind of like a cult figure. So there are exceptions to this rule, and of course, I'm looking at a certain genre of book. So, this is something that you would want to do as well. If you're designing a specific type of book, then gather a bunch of these book jackets or look at them on Amazon and start to see, well, what do books like this look like? Of course, they all look different, but again, they have some certain things in common. For this genre of book, I noticed that mostly the title or the text is set in a serif typeface. So a serif is the kind of typeface that has these little um, little protrusions that come out at the top and the bottom. Sometimes you'll see it set in a sans serif typeface. You can usually see that there's plenty of leading on the font or on the typesetting. What else can we take a look at? Let's think about the contrast. So I'm always talking about, maybe there's not enough contrast between the background and the text. And when there's not enough contrast, when the text and the background are a similar hue, even if they're a different color, it's going to be hard to read. So on this one, very dark black text on a light background, dark text on a light background, light text on a dark background, light text on a dark background. And this cover has the advantage of having foil stamping, which is a way to make the letters look italic. So they actually are shiny and reflective, and they stand out from that background a lot more than if this was just like a yellow ink. This one, light text on a dark background. Same thing here. And this one also has metallic. It's called foil stamping. It's a process that makes the letters look like they're metallic or made out of metal. All right, so it's really important to remember to use a dark background with light text or light text with dark background. I can't stress that enough. Let's take a look at the back of these. And I apologize that I'm holding this phone with holding the phone with one hand, so I'm being a little clumsy here, but let's look at the back cover on these. On the back covers, what I invariably am seeing is some book reviews. So usually they say something like praise for, and then the title of the book. So here's praise for Fortune is a River. Here's praise for Cleopatra the Great. This one says acclaim for Cleopatra, advance praise for. This is the only one that doesn't say that, but that's okay because I see that there are several reviews here, and there's little quoted, some text in quotes, and then there's the author's name and, something, where is he from, or is he an author of another book? And they all follow this format, okay? And there's usually quite a few. So on your books, maybe you don't have this much information, and this is where you would use that lorem ipsum text. Okay, this one is probably the lightest on the praise on the back, but it still looks, when we look at the layout of the text, or the way the text is set on these back covers, it looks purposeful. It looks like there's just enough text for the space that the designer had. There's plenty of leading, okay, between the lines of text. That means the space between lines of text. There's plenty of contrast between the background and the text. So again, here we've got light text on a dark background. Here we've got dark text on a light background, and they're all like that. Now, in some cases, like on this, generally red text on black is not very, it's harder to read. And in this case, the only thing set in red is the source for the quotes. And that is actually meant to recede from your eye a little bit or be less noticeable than the quotes themselves. So it's a secondary type of information than the actual text of the quotes. And so the designer is using that color rather than really the size or the relative size of the text. They're using that red color to make that a secondary thing, or the second thing that you see. Okay, so that's something that I notice, is that none of this text looks crowded to me. There's a margin. Again, there's not too much, not too little spacing. There's some space between the different quoted paragraphs. And none of it looks like there's not enough. Like, none of it to me looks like the designers said, I just don't have enough here, so I'm going to try to fill this up. Maybe I'll make the text really large, or maybe I'll spread it out really far, or maybe I'll put some decorative elements in between the text, and maybe I can just fill that space. So that's what I don't see here. What else can we look at on the back? Just the size of the text itself. This is normal body copy size. So body copy is when you have, body copy is what you'd see in a magazine or a book. That's just the text, the paragraphs of text that you're reading. It's usually longer text. And standard typical size for body text is between 8 and 12 points. 12 is pretty big. It just depends, of course, on the format of the thing that you're designing and the typeface and that sort of thing. But for something like this size, a book, somewhere between 8 and 12 is good. Anything larger than 12 is that's really wouldn't even be considered body text. That's something like a subhead or headline or something like that. So this is all normal standard body text size, not too large. And another thing that I notice on these back covers is that they all have the ISBN barcode. And with this barcode, I notice when I look at, I've just got 6 books here, and they're all slightly different. There's really no standard that I'm aware of anyway for this, but they're all kind of not too big and they're not too tiny. And if there's kind of a consistency, and these are all coming from different designers, different publishers, but there's kind of a general understanding that, this is kind of the size approximately of how big this barcode should be. And then sometimes there's other information like publisher's name. All right. Let's take a look at the spines, and this is harder to do because I can't prop them all up, but the spines are fairly simple. They've got the title of the book, the author's name, and maybe the publisher is another typical thing that would be on the side, logo for the publisher. It's not too big. Again, there's a definite hierarchy of information. So like on this Cleopatra book, if Cleopatra, the name of the book, is the largest thing on the cover, then it's also the largest thing on the spine. And the treatment of the text, or the typography on the cover, is carried over onto the spine. It's adapted to the dimension of the spine, but you want some kind of consistency from the front cover to the spine. And they all pretty much follow that format. Sometimes they have a little image or something that carries through the cover art to the spine. Another thing that we could notice as well is, let's look at the flaps. All right, so we have the inner and out, the front and the back flap on these books. And if I look at the text on these flaps, typically the front flap is going to have some kind of little summary or synopsis of the book, so you can get an idea of what the book is going to be about before you buy it. And then the back flap is going to have some author information. Maybe that synopsis continues onto the back flap, and then there's an image of the author and some info and some, cover credit for the artwork. Where did they get this artwork? There's some pricing information. And that is pretty consistent from cover to cover, okay? I mean, we can open all of these, and they're all very, very similar. So one thing I do notice about the typography on these flaps is that it's also body text size. So it's no bigger than 12 point. I mean, most of this looks like it's quite a bit smaller. It's probably, 9, 10, 11 points at the most. And there's no problems with, there's margin, there's plenty of leading, there's paragraph breaks. In this case, the paragraphs are broken by some space between the paragraphs. In this case, the paragraphs are broken not with space between the paragraphs, but some paragraph indents. Okay, and another thing I notice is that on the front and the back flap, well, what's more important? Who's more important, the author or the synopsis of the book? I would say they're like kind of the same level of importance, same type of information, the things that are going to help the reader decide if this is something that they're interested in. So you've got a synopsis of the book, and then, hey, this is what the author is, this is something about the author. Are they authoritative? Are they somebody I can trust? So I notice that the text is treated, the type is set in the same way from the front to the back cover. There's no variation. In other words, we don't start with 8-point text here and then it goes to 14 here or something like that. And we see that on all of these. Okay, so the text or the type set from the front to the back flaps on all of these books is going to be consistent spacing, consistent font, consistent size, even though it's different information, synopsis versus author. Another thing before I end this particular segment is just to think about, like I did talk about, generally this kind of book has a serif font that's being used, but one of the principles of typography anyway, and this is, even if you haven't taken typography, this is extremely important. One of the principles of typography, good typography, is that you want to stick with generally not use more than 2 fonts or 2 typeface designs in a single design. Now, sometimes we can break that rule. Maybe a designer will use a 3rd one as a highlight kind of a thing, but very sparingly. So if we look at this cover, there's a typeface, sans serif or serif typeface is being used for the title, and then there's a different sans serif that's more of a standard text font that's being used for the text inside, and that's it. This one, there's a particular typeface that's being used for this headline and the cover information. Then there's more of a standard serif text font, something that's just kind of a classic, not too fancy. The same font from the cover is being used as a drop cap or initial cap. And that's it. So we've got 2 fonts being used on that one. This one, we've got a little bit more. This designer, however, is very skilled. And so this designer is using a combination of a few different fonts, kind of a fancy serif font that looks like an engraving. And then there's a regular kind of a serif font. Here it's in italic. And then there's a sans serif font. Okay, so there's 3 so far that I'm identifying. But the one that's used for the title is only being used for the title, and then just this kind of larger author name, and that's it. Otherwise, it's mostly going to be that other just standard serif font, and then there's a sans serif for a couple highlight areas. All right, so again, the rule is to use 1 or 2 fonts for your design. One more, we'll take a look at the Cleopatra book. I see this particular serif font being used, and that is it. This is a italic version of that font, but that's it. So basically it's one typeface for this entire design, just used in different ways. All right, so next we're going to take a look at some of the book covers that you designed.